Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Wilson. In this channel, I talk about money and personal finance. If you like any of those things, don't forget to hit the like, bell, and subscribe so you'll be notified of upcoming videos. This week, I want to talk about a book that I recently read, and it's called The Psychology of Money. Traditionally, a lot of books on personal investing and finance, they look at money as more of a science where there's laws and rules. Whereas this book, they look at money as more of an art, and that's subjective in nature and that's guided by human behavior. So let's just get right into it, and I'll describe what I've learned in this book. So like I said before, a lot of people look at money rigidly. They look at money like the subject physics, where it's guided by rules and laws, and less more like a subject like psychology, where there's more emotions and it's more nuanced. Money's everywhere and it's all around us, and it confuses us. Everyone thinks about money differently. Take, for example, the financial crisis in 2008. Nobody predicted it. If money were rigid like the subject physics, where there's rules and laws, people could predict it, but nobody saw it coming. But you could see that money is guided more about human behavior. In the first chapter, the author Morgan Housel describes how people look at money, and nobody's crazy. People look at money from their own personal experience with money, and that represents about 0.0001% of what's actually happened in the world. But in their own minds, it's actually 80% of how the world actually works. I guess what Morgan's trying to say is your personal thoughts on money overestimate on the realities of how money actually works. If you grew up in an environment of high inflation, like the 70s, you'll think that inflation is inevitable, and you'll invest like that. For a person that grew up in the 1930s through the Great Depression versus a 90s tech worker in the dot-com boom, they look at risk greatly differently and is so vastly different. The point that he makes is no amount of studying or open-mindedness could ever recreate the fear and uncertainty that people go through in their life. So in summary, what he's saying is we all make crazy decisions on investments and personal finance, but no one's crazy. We all make decisions based on our own unique experiences that make sense to us in a given moment. In the next chapter, he talks about luck and risk. Luck and risk are siblings, and what that means is they're both the reality that every outcome in life is guided by something outside of individual effort. He goes on to talk about Bill Gates as an example. And what you might know about Bill Gates is he came from a high school called Lakeside High School in Seattle. And what you don't know is there was a high school teacher in that school called Bill Duggal. And he was actually a World War II pilot. And he believed that real-world experience always trumps book studying. He also realized that students needed to know about the computer before they got to college. So he actually petitioned all the moms in the Lakeside High School annual rummage sale to take all the proceeds to buy a computer. And what happened was Bill Gates was lucky enough to get onto this computer, and he loved it. And his classmate Paul Allen was also obsessed with it. So the two of them would obsess over programming and software development. The computer program wasn't part of the general curriculum. It's actually an extracurricular program. They would take weekends and late nights to toy with this computer and would be computing experts. And if we're talking about luck, let's take a look at these stats. In 1968, there's 303 million high school students. 18 million of them lived in the US. 270,000 lived in Washington State. 100,000 of them lived in the Seattle area. And about 300 of them went to Lakeside High School. So you start with 303 million and you boil it down to 300. That's a 1 in a million chance that you attend a high school like Lakeside High School and you'd have the cash and foresight to buy a computer. And Bill Gates was one of them, and he was obsessed with it. In this chapter, he talks about someone else called Kent Evans. And what you don't know about Kent Evans is he was actually Bill Gates' classmate. He was also part of the computer program and was obsessed with the computer. Bill Gates, Paul Allen, and Kent Evans was a small group that was obsessed with the computer and would toy with the computer on weekends and late nights. And what you don't know about Kent Evans is he was smart like Bill Gates in a business sense. He wasn't like Paul Allen, where he was obsessed with coding and computers. Bill Gates shared the same passion in business with Kent Evans. However, what you don't know is Kent Evans died in a mountaineering accident before he even finished high school. And that's a 1 in a million chance that you could die in a mountaineering accident. So as you could see, luck and risk is the same force with the same magnitude working in opposite directions. I think the lesson for me here is that you want to focus less on the individual and more on broad patterns. In this extreme case with Bill Gates, you want to avoid the highlights of human effort because it doesn't count for all the risk and luck that was involved. It's least applicable to me because it's influenced by extreme luck, and luck is hard to emulate. What you should do instead is look for broad patterns and characteristics of entrepreneurs, and hard work is one of them. And hard work is a characteristic you can emulate and control. and implement into your own life. In the third chapter titled Never Enough, Morgan talks about this concept of enough. He used an example of Rajat Gupta. He was born into poverty in Calcutta. People talk about being born in privilege, being born on third base. In Gupta's case, he couldn't even see the baseball stadium. Eventually, Gupta worked so hard that he became the CEO of McKinsey, the biggest and brightest consulting firm in the world. Gupta obviously was a very influential man, and he sat on the board of Goldman Sachs. What you didn't know is, in 2008, he had a lucrative side hustle. He knew that because Goldman Sachs was in financial trouble, Warren Buffett was going to invest $5 billion in the bank just to have it survive. So what Gupta did is he called the hedge fund manager Rajaratnam and placed an order for buying Goldman Sachs stock. And just like that, he was $17 million richer. He took extraordinary amounts of risk to make $17 million, and his net worth was worth $100 million, which eventually led him to being thrown in jail. The second example is Bernie Madoff. And as you know, Bernie Madoff is the modern day example of the Ponzi scheme. He promised investors a lucrative amount in returns. What he did was he'd funnel more money in and just pay off the people that were at the top. He eventually got caught and was thrown in jail too. What Bernie Madoff and Gupta have in common is that it was never enough for them. They're willing to risk a lot just for a little bit for their overall wealth. They were willing to risk everything just to get more. And in this chapter, Morgan outlines 4 things you should remember. The first thing is the hardest financial skill is getting the goalposts to stop moving. It gets dangerous when the taste of having more money, more power, more prestige, more status, increases ambition faster than satisfaction. In that case, one step forward pushes the goalpost 2 steps ahead. You feel as if you're falling behind, and the only way to catch up is to take greater and greater risk. The second thing is social comparison is the problem here. There's always going to be someone that's richer than you and that has more money than you, so you'll always be chasing, and your goalposts will always extend. The ceilings of social comparison is so high that no one will ever hit it. The third thing is that enough is too little and conservative, and you're really leaving potential and money on the table. Enough is realizing the opposite. An insatiable appetite for more will eventually push you to a point of regret. A good example is like eating your favorite food. There's gonna be a point where you're so full you won't even like your favorite food that you've been eating. The fourth thing is that there's many things never worth risking at all, no matter what the potential is. And that's reputation, freedom, family and friends, health, and being loved by the ones that love you. It's best to know when is enough and to stop taking risks that might harm the important things. Chapter 4 talks about confounding compounding. That means that little growth serves as fuel for big growth in the future. Take Warren Buffett, for example. He started investing when he was 10 years old, and he amassed $1 million by the time he's 30. And that's $9.3 million inflation adjusted. So let's just say he was like a normal person, and in his teens and in his 20s, he was trying to find his passions, and he only amassed $25,000 by the time he's 30. And let's just say he kept up with his extraordinary returns at 22% a year. And let's just say he would quit investing by the time he's 60, and he'd just play golf and play with his grandkids. And what will be his rough estimate of his net worth? Not the 80+ billion that he has today. It would be 11.9 million. And that's 99.9% less of what he actually has right now. Think about that. That's the power of compounding. Warren Buffett's skill is in investing, but his secret is time. And that's the thing, a lot of people can't conceptualize compounding. They think in linear. If you were to say, let's just add 8 plus 8 plus 8 7 times. That's 8 times 7, 72. But how about if we do 8 times 8 times 8, 8 times? That's 8 to the power of 8. And that is 134,217,728. It's this counterintuitiveness of linear thinking rather than exponential compounding that leads us into making bad investment decisions. We tend to make these Hail Mary investments thinking that these one-off huge gains would make us rich. But the risk is not worth the reward, like I said before. Rather, stay in the game, be like Warren Buffett, and use the power of compounding, which leverages time to get rich. In the next chapter, Morgan talks about getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. And it covers one of the most famous investors, Jesse Livermore. Jesse Livermore shorted the stock market in 1929, and he made a tremendous amount of wealth. That was a huge bet, and it paid off. But he made subsequent huge bets again, and then he lost it all. The thing is, he knew how to get wealthy, but he didn't know how to stay wealthy. And that's the key thing here. The key is to survive. The key here is not to have any investment that can ruin you in one shot. Keeping money requires the opposite of taking risk. It requires humility. It's the fear that one day all could be taken away from you just as quickly as it can be coming in. Another example is Rick Guerin. I talked about Warren Buffett and his partner Charlie Munger, but you didn't know that there was a third person in their partnership, and that was Rick Guerin. Rick Guerin was skilled like Warren and Charlie in investing. What you didn't know is Rick was heavily levered in margin calls in the 1970s, and he got margin called, and he was forced to sell, incurring huge losses. He took on huge risk that eventually collapsed him. Rick, Warren, and Charlie had the skill of investing, but only Warren and Charlie had the skill of staying wealthy. In the book, Morgan outlines 3 things that apply the survival mindset. The first one is, more than big returns, you want to be financially unbreakable. If unbreakable, you get the biggest returns because you stick around long enough so that compounding could work its magic. And number 2, planning is important. You have to plan that your plan won't go to plan. What I mean is, the most important part of a plan is there room for error. What you initially thought to play out may not go according to 100% of what you see. A good plan embraces room for error. It's called a margin of safety. It's raising your odds of success at a given level of risk by increasing the chances of your survival. The third is having a barbell personality. It's being optimistic about the future, but paranoid about what will prevent you from getting to where you want. Sensible optimism is a belief that the odds are in your favor, and over time, things will balance out to a good outcome, even if what happens in the middle is filled with misery. In fact, you know it would be filled with misery. The idea that something could gain over the long term, but be a basket case in the short term, is not intuitive, but that's how a lot of things work in life. You need short-term paranoia to keep you around long enough so you can exploit long-term optimism. The 6th chapter talks about tail events. And tail events, or he calls them long tails, is the furthest end of a distribution curve of possible outcomes. These long tails rarely occur, but have tremendous influence in finance. Small events that rarely occur have the biggest financial weight. Like I said before, anything extreme, huge, profitable, or famous is a result of a tail event, and that's attributed to luck or risk. And like what I said before, the key is to stick around long enough so you be exposed to long tail events so you can exploit and take advantage of these opportunities. Chapter 7 and 8 talks about freedom and man in a car paradox. Freedom really is doing whatever you want with who you want, whenever you want, for however long you want. And that's priceless. This is the highest dividend that money pays. Doing what you love on a schedule you can't control is the same as doing something that you hate. And man in a car paradox. He doesn't say that he's against luxury cars. What he outlines is the irony of everything. When you see someone driving a nice car, you might think, wow, look at that person. He's driving a nice car. He must be so cool. But what you really think is, wow, that car is cool. How cool would I look in that car? Subconscious or not, this is how people think. The focus isn't on the person, it's really on themselves. People generally gawk at the car, imagine themselves driving the car without even noticing the person driving it. It's a subtle recognition that people generally aspire to be respected and admired, and thinking that buying fancy things will get you there may bring less of what you actually imagine. He goes on to say that humility, kindness, and empathy will bring you more respect than horsepower ever will. Chapter 10 really stood out to me because it talks about saving money. Building wealth has little to do with high income or big investment returns, and has a lot to do with savings rate. Wealth is an accumulation of leftovers after you spend what you take in. You can build wealth without a high-paying income, but there's no chance you could build wealth without a high savings rate. Learning to be happy with less money creates a gap between what you have and what you want, similar to the gap you get from growing your paycheck, but it's easier and more in your control. A lot of what we want is associated with our ego. Past a certain level of income, what you want sits below your ego. One of the most powerful ways to increase your savings isn't to raise your income, it's to raise your humility. People with enduring financial success are not necessarily those with high incomes. They tend to have a propensity to not give a damn what other people think of them. Every bit of saving is like a time in the future that would have been owned by someone else and giving it back to yourself. When you don't have control over your time, you're forced to accept whatever bad luck is thrown your way. But if you have flexibility, you have the time to wait for no-brainer opportunities to fall onto your lap. This is the hidden return on savings. Chapter 12 is called Surprise and looks at history as a guide rather than a map for the future. It's smart to have a deep appreciation for economic and investing history. It gives us a rough guide, but it's not a map of the future. Investing isn't like a science with hard rules and laws. Rather, it's a massive group of human beings making imperfect decisions based on human behavior and with limited info. Even the smartest people get nervous, fearful, and greedy. The author outlines 2 dangers in relying too heavily on investment history. The first is you'll likely miss tail events that move the needle the most. That's because the most important economic events of the future, things that move the needle the most, are things that history that give little to no guide about. History is a misleading guide because it doesn't account for structural changes. Take the S&P 500. It didn't include financial stocks up until 1976. Today, financials make up 16% of the whole S&P. Technology stocks were virtually non-existent 50 years ago. Today, they're more than a fifth of the whole S&P. Accounting rules have changed over time, so have disclosures, auditing, and the amount of market liquidity. things have changed. And the last chapter I want to outline is chapter 18. It's called When You'll Believe Anything. Stories and narratives are the most powerful force in our economy. At a personal level, there's two things you have to keep in mind about a story-driven world when managing your money. The first is the more you want something to be true, the more likely you'll believe a story that overestimates the odds of it being true. The author calls them appealing fictions. It's when you want to find a solution, but you have a combination of limited control and high stakes. There's so many financial opinions that once you pick a side, you're not only invested financially, but mentally as well. Many default to believe that what they believe is not only true, but unequivocally true. And this leaves no room for error. And number two is everyone has an incomplete view of the world, but we form complete narratives to fill the gap. Most people, when they're confronted with something they don't understand, they come up with an explanation based on their own biases. The underlying root is we want things to make sense. We confuse money and investment with the fields of precision, like astrophysics, with fields of uncertainty, like money and investing. We comfort ourselves by telling us how much control we have. We focus on what we know rather than what we don't know. And this makes us feel confident in our beliefs. And that's it. Those are the major things I learned in the book Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. If you like this video and you like book reviews, don't forget to hit the like, bell, and subscribe so you're notified of upcoming videos. See you next time.